Colossal Questions.
Why don't Americans have English accents? Even though there's tons of region-specific accents, like Brooklynese in the US and Cockney in England, most people think of two specific accents for Americans and the English. The typical English accent is called BBC pronunciation, or BBC English, and the accent that most Americans think of as having no accent is called the General American or newscaster accent. Okay, so now that we've got that down, let's get right to it. When English settlers first colonized Jamestown, Virginia in the early 1600s, they all had English accents because, well, they were from England. Seems pretty simple, right? Well, not quite. You see, they weren't speaking with that BBC English accent that we recognize today. So what did their accent sound like in the early 1600s? Well, we don't know for sure since there was no way to record anyone's voice back then. But we do know the difference was in how they pronounced their R's. In those days, English people spoke with a hard R sound, meaning they pronounced the R in words like Americans do today. So, for example, it would sound more like park the car instead of park the car. It wasn't until the early 1800s that using the soft R's became fashionable among England's upper class. Over the next century, the posh, classy accent became the standard across the country. The upper class in US cities that still had close ties to England, like Savannah, Richmond, and Boston, started using this cool new English accent too. But it wasn't long before Americans would have an accent all their own. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, power and influence began shifting to parts of the US that were more populated by people of Scottish and Irish descent who spoke with accents that have hard R's. As this new generation of self-made elites came to power across the US, the fancy English accent slowly went away and the general American accent spread across the country. So, did Americans ever speak with an English accent? Yup, but it probably sounded more like an American accent than you'd think. What is Juneteenth? The name Juneteenth is short for June 19th, the day Juneteenth is celebrated each year. Why June 19th? Well, that was the day that US troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, all the way back in 1865 to make sure all formerly enslaved people in the state were freed. This was a full 2 months after the Civil War ended, and 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. This executive order was issued by President Lincoln on January 1st, 1863. It stated that all enslaved people in Confederate states that were rebelling against the United States, quote, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. This freed all slaves across the country. On paper, at least. In reality, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free anyone right away. It applied to places under Confederate control, which meant that, in practice, the law was only enforced once Union soldiers took control of Confederate territory. The problem was, nothing had changed in a far-flung state like Texas, which stayed on the outskirts of the Civil War. No major battles were fought in the Lone Star State, so there were no Union troops to impose the new law. But that finally changed on June 19th, 1865, when Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, and read General Orders No. 3, which said,
The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free.
So, Juneteenth marks the true beginning of the end of slavery in the United States. Just a few months later, slavery in America was formally abolished with the 13th Amendment. Also known as Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, Liberation Day, or Emancipation Day, this holiday has been celebrated each year in Texas on June 19th ever since. Over the years, the Juneteenth tradition has spread all around the country, and in 1980, Texas was the first state to make it an official state holiday. By 2006, 14 more states had recognized it, and just 2 years later, almost half of the 50 states observed Juneteenth. By 2019, 47 states and Washington, D.C. has recognized Juneteenth, everywhere but North Dakota, South Dakota, and Hawaii. As of 2021, it's not yet recognized as a national holiday. But with more and more people starting to celebrate the holiday each and every year, it's only a matter of time before that changes for good and Juneteenth is here to stay. Can the US president be arrested? Let's get right to it. Most leading experts believe that, no, the sitting president cannot be arrested. This is because arresting the leader of the free world would make it pretty hard for the government to function. And if someone actually tried to arrest the president, it wouldn't go so well. Presidents are constantly protected by trained security called the Secret Service. If any police officer or citizen tried to walk up and arrest the president, Secret Service could easily protect them from the arresting officer. So the US president can't be arrested, but what happens if they commit a crime? That could trigger a process called impeachment, which is a fancy official way for Congress to say, "We have a good reason to believe the president committed a crime." From there, the trial has pretty similar rules to a normal trial for any other person. If the president is found guilty, they are removed from office and the vice president takes over. But it's very rare for that to ever happen. First of all, impeachment can only happen if a majority of congresspeople and 2/3 of senators vote for it. That means just one person can't file charges against the president. It takes hundreds of elected officials working together. Because it can be so hard to impeach a president without good reason, it's only happened twice in the entire history of the US, and both presidents were found innocent. A third president, Richard Nixon, was almost impeached, but he resigned before he could be kicked out of office for orchestrating a hotel break-in. His vice president, Gerald Ford, who took over for Nixon after he resigned, scrubbed Nixon clean of his crimes by pardoning him. So, in other words, if you're president, either don't break the law or at least be friends with the next president. Why are ancient ruins underground? It turns out there are lots of different reasons why ancient ruins are found underground. Sometimes archaeologists dig up things that were buried back in ancient times, like graveyards or trash pits. Abandoned cities in jungles and forests can gradually become overgrown as layers of decaying plants build up. Ruins in unstable places like deserts or swamps get slowly swallowed up by erosion. Occasionally, a terrible disaster like an earthquake, a flood, or volcano can destroy a city all at once. So that's why some cities get buried. But what about the rest of them that aren't swallowed by swamps or buried in lava? The answer actually has a lot less to do with the earth and a lot more to do with humans. In the ancient world, most buildings weren't exactly built to last. They were made of mud or mud bricks, which aren't very durable. When a house or building eventually collapsed, the rain, wind, snow, or other weather would turn the muddy rubble into a big pile of mush. When the next person came along to build a house on the same spot, they would usually just build on top of the old rubble, burying it. This process happens again and again and again and again, and before you know it, voila! The rubble of an ancient house is buried underground. More durable ancient buildings made of stone or brick are usually only partially buried. These kinds of buildings only end up totally buried when humans get involved. Medieval and Renaissance builders would reuse pieces of ancient buildings to make new ones. In some cases, buildings were destroyed and new structures were built on top of the old foundation. Complete destruction from fire or war tended to speed up the process too, and there was plenty of that in the ancient world. Conquering nations would often build new buildings on top of the ruins of the city they just destroyed. Once a city is abandoned for the last time, erosion or other natural forces gradually grind the rubble into a barely noticeable bump on the landscape. Over time, archaeologists have learned to look for these unassuming bumps. So keep your eyes open next time you go for a walk. That weird-looking hill might just be a majestic lost city, or just a whole lot of dirt. How did the Olympics start? The very first Olympic Games on record date back thousands of years to 776 BCE in a Greek city-state named Elis. And that's just the first games we know about. Most experts believe the Olympics were already 500 years old by then. So, needless to say, it's one of humanity's most ancient athletic competitions. Just like today, the ancient Olympics were held every 4 years, and athletes came from city-states across Greece to compete. Early Olympic Games consisted mainly of foot races and wrestling, but over the years, the Greeks added other games like boxing, discus, javelin, chariot racing, and even competitions for heralds and trumpeters. The more grueling events were often bundled together to create larger contests like the pentathlon, which includes a foot race, the long jump, discus, javelin, and wrestling. With the rise of the Roman Empire, the popularity and importance of the Olympics diminished in favor of gladiatorial tournaments and other Roman competitions. Finally, in 393 CE, the Roman Emperor decided to officially abolish the Olympics, declaring it far too non-religious for their newly Christian empire. Just like that, the mighty Olympic Games were gone for good. Or so it seemed. Around the time of the Renaissance, people began to get interested in ancient Greek culture. It became a major influence in art and got people thinking about all their different customs, including the Olympics. In 1892, the ball truly got rolling when a French historian and teacher named Pierre de Coubertin made a serious proposal to revive the Olympic Games as a modern international competition every 4 years, bringing glory to the winners and their home countries. 2 years later, Pierre's idea was approved, and the modern Olympics finally got the go-ahead to start planning. The International Olympic Committee was formed, and the first games were scheduled for 1896, in where else but Athens, the capital of Greece. By the 1924 Olympics in Paris, more than 3,000 people competed, including more than 100 women from 44 different countries. That's also the year that the Winter Olympics were first introduced. Nowadays, the Olympic Games are considered the greatest international sports competition. Many of the world's best athletes compete in hundreds of events and spend endless hours honing their skills in anticipation of the Games every 4 years. The 2020 Summer Olympic Games in Tokyo may have been delayed, but once it finally kicks off, there will be 339 different events across 33 sports. There will be 5 new Olympic sports too. Surfing, sport climbing, skateboarding, and karate will debut, and both baseball and softball will be back in the Olympics for the first time since 2008. They're also adding some new events within sports that already compete, like 3-on-3 basketball and freestyle BMX. So get ready, because it's gonna be an epic show, just like it's always been. Why do countries have flags? Thousands of years before modern flags started flying all across the world, ancient armies like the Egyptians and Persians carried special symbols into battle called vexilloids. These early ancestors of modern flags were fairly different from the ones we see today. For starters, they weren't made of fabric. These vexilloids were usually a large staff with a giant carved emblem at the top. The Romans took this tradition and, as they often did, managed to make it their own. Roman soldiers carried large lances with shiny metal eagles mounted at the top. The change from 3D objects to flat fabric flags didn't take hold until the introduction of Chinese silk. Silk was a highly desirable fabric, and trading of silk happened along a route known as the Silk Road. The Chinese Silk Road traveled west from China through the Middle East, where cloth flags first came into fashion. These flags helped identify someone's rank, depending on the fabric and complexity of the flag. Lower-level officers usually settled for basic cotton flags, while high-ranking officials would have woven silk flags, embroidered with shining silver or gold thread. Eventually, cloth flags continued their way across the Silk Road to Europe, where knights in heavy armor started using flags as a way to identify themselves on the battlefield. Those flags identified a knight's rank, social class, land, or noble titles. Okay, so that's where flags came from, but when did they change from a personal ID to a symbol for each country? Well, you can thank the American and French Revolutions for that. The simple red, white, and blue design of the revolutionary American and French flags were very distinct from all the fancy flags of the day. Since the revolutionaries were rejecting the rule of a king or queen, they designed their flags to feel modern, and most importantly, different from the flags kings and queens flew. For the first time, These flags were meant to represent an entire nation of citizens rather than just a noble house or family. As these revolutionary ideas caught on, more and more countries wanted to adopt their own flags as representations of their nations. And before long, countries all across the world had flags of their very own.
Why is the pride flag rainbow?
The rainbow flag dates all the way back to the 1970s. 1978 to be exact. That was the year that a group of artists, designers, activists, performers, and locals designed the very first version of the gay pride flag. This ragtag group of flag makers brought the idea to a famous gay icon and politician named Harvey Milk, who liked the idea and got behind the project. They wanted to create a flag that could fly over the Pride Parade in their home city of San Francisco. The team quickly landed on a rainbow design because rainbows are natural, colorful, and beautiful. The collection of colors represent togetherness, since there are LGBTQ+ people from all races, religions, ages, genders, everywhere. The very first flag looked a bit different than the one we know today. It had 8 stripes instead of 6, with a pink at the top and turquoise between the green and blue stripes. When they took their design to get printed, it turned out that the printing company could only make flags in around 25 colors, and pink and turquoise weren't available. So the team made a few adjustments and came back with the 6-striped rainbow flag we know today. Each individual color has its own meaning. Red for life, orange for healing, yellow for sunlight, green for nature, blue for serenity, and purple for the spirit. The bright, colorful new flag flew for the first time in the Gay Freedom Day Parade on June 25, 1978. People at the parade proudly waved the new symbol, helping make it an overnight success. Over the years, the flag has continued to evolve. In 2017, one of the members of the original team made a variation on the 8-stripe design, adding a 9th lavender stripe to the top, symbolizing diversity. A year later, in 2018, another version, called the Progress Pride flag, was created to bring attention to trans pride and queer communities of color, adding a chevron with 5 colors: black, brown, light blue, pink, and white. The black and brown stripes represent marginalized LGBTQ+ communities of color. The pink, light blue, and white stripes are a nod to the transgender pride flag. So that's where the rainbow flag got started, but it does seem safe to say that the design will continue to evolve over the years. After all, there's lots of great colors out there to add.
Did pirates bury treasure?
It turns out that the history of pirates pillaging and plundering, there are only a few cases where real-life pirates actually buried treasure. And it wasn't how you see it in the movies. Maybe the most famous example comes from an English privateer named Sir Francis Drake. A privateer was basically a legal British mercenary pirate. They were paid by the British government to hunt down and capture criminals at sea. A privateer was usually limited to tracking down one particular ship for a certain period of time. So Drake might not have been a card-carrying pirate, but he lived the scallywag lifestyle. In 1573, Drake and his men captured tons of Spanish gold and silver. In an attempt to keep it from being recaptured, they decided to bury the treasure along the Panama coast. But unlike a classic pirate tale, Drake didn't leave the cash for long. He left guards with the gold and quickly came back to get it once the coast was clear. Okay, so if in real life pirates rarely buried any treasure, then why do we almost always picture pirates doing it today? A lot of modern pirate myths can trace their origins to a book from 1833 called Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. His book is about Caribbean pirates in the 1700s, and its depiction of pirates influenced just about every swashbuckling story that followed. In the book, pirates are always shown wearing eye patches, peg legs, and flamboyant costumes. They're often bloodthirsty, say things like "arr," and might even have a parrot perched on their shoulder. And they always bury their booty with an X and draw a treasure map to the spot.
These things were all colorful character traits that were added into the book to make it more exciting. But none of them were common among real-life pirates. First of all, there have been all kinds of pirates all around the world, not just Pirates of the Caribbean. Famous pirates hailed from China, Africa, the Middle East, and all sorts of other places, with their own pirate codes and traditions. So if pirates weren't quite like we picture them and never really buried their treasure, then what did they do with all that plunder? The answer is simpler than you might think. They spent it. Pirates love to party, play games, and have a good time as much as anyone. And a heaping helping of gold doubloons keep the good times rolling. Even still, there are those who are convinced that some lost pirate fortunes are still buried in the wild, waiting to be found. So next time you're alone in a Caribbean cave, you may as well bring your metal detector.